Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
The man who sold honours, the first modern cash for honours scandal, paying for a peerage, an illegal practice, feels like a very modern form of corruption, one that both Labour and the Conservative parties have been accused of indulging in at times. However, the first modern cash for peerage scandal goes back almost 100 years, and I'm delighted to say that a book has been written called The Man Who Sold Honours. It's by Stephen Bates, who you may know from his work at the BBC, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and I'm delighted to say he's joining Talk Radio Europe this morning. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Giles. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you. And I'm very, very much looking forward to this because I am that worst sort of creature, an armchair historian. The listeners will be banging their heads against the wireless set, going, "Oh, for goodness sake, he's about to go down his historical rabbit hole again." Just explain to me how this particular fascinating case crossed your radar.
Well, I spent quite a lot of my career covering politics for various organisations, the BBC, Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, and The Guardian. I spent the best part of a decade at Westminster and also 5 years in Brussels as The Guardian's European editor. So I saw quite a lot of politics from quite a wide degree of perspectives.
And we seem to think that this sort of the cash for peerages is something that has been around for, I don't know, since the turn of this century. But your research or this book focuses on basically something that was happening. Are we talking sort of 1920s, 1930s? Set the scene, if you will.
Yes, it's really came to life and light in the period after the First World War. There had been rumblings about people buying honours for a number of years before the First World War. It then went quiet because of the war. And in the 1920s, the early 1920s, Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, needed to raise money for his political fund. He was leading a coalition government which was largely made up of Tories. Of course, he was a Liberal. The Tories didn't like or trust him, and so he knew that the life of the coalition following the war was going to be fairly short. He needed to raise money. He'd split the Liberal Party by overthrowing the previous Liberal Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, in the middle of the war. So he was quite hated by a lot of Liberals as well. But he didn't see that as the end of his political career. He thought he had a very good chance of staying on as Prime Minister. But he needed money, which he didn't have. He was a working class man originally. And so he employed this chap, Maundy Gregory, who's the subject of this book, who set up office in Whitehall, just opposite Downing Street. And if you wanted a knighthood or a baronetcy or a peerage, he was the best person to go to because he would put your name forward for a certain degree of cash. He was selling honours for quite a lot of money. And, of course, a lot of people had done very well out of the First World War, manufacturers and various spivs and unlikely war heroes. And you'd go and see Maundy Gregory in his office and he'd say he could put you down on the next honours list. Small consideration, palms needed to be greased and all that. £10,000 if you wanted a knighthood, £30,000 if you wanted a baronetcy, which gave you a hereditary title, and £50,000 for the full steam, full fat honour of a peerage. And he did pretty well out of that for a number of years until the law finally caught up with him.
I love the idea of a sliding scale, him rocking up with a menu saying, would Sir like the peerage, the baronet, or the full-on, would you just like the Duchy of Lancaster and get on with it, basically?
Well, that was effectively what he was saying to them. He couldn't guarantee it, of course, but certainly a little cash would help grease the wheels. And he did quite well on commission out of it. He was earning, at his peak, probably about 30,000 quid a year, which doesn't sound a huge amount today, but was then a phenomenal sum. I mean, it was 5 times what a cabinet minister earned. So it was something that did him quite well for quite a long time.
Would it be fair to call him one of these interesting sort of between the wars colourful characters? Because he's not a sort of dyed in the wool civil servant, is he? He's not a Whitehall mandarin, right? So tell me a little bit about him.
He was a rascal. Basically, he'd had a number of careers, most of which hadn't been very successful, had failed. He'd been an actor. He'd also been a theatrical impresario, though that ended in a disaster. He'd been a sort of newspaper magazine editor. He'd also, in the First World War, he claimed been a spy master, rather unlikely, I think. And he also owned a club in the West End for some period. So a lot of careers, making money and not always terribly successfully. But honours touting, which is what it was called, was the most profitable thing he ever did.
And when we say he had a club, I mean, it wasn't saying he was the Peter Stringfellow of the 1920s. Are we? Was it a gentleman's club? Or, I mean, did he have a network of connections? Because I'm just interested how somebody like this, impresario, actor, etc. I mean, how does he get himself unveiled into the situation where he can actually offer these peerages? Because, he's not standing outside Westminster saying, get your honours here, is he?
Well, almost. No, I mean, he was an expert schmoozer. He claimed lots of contacts. He could ring up anybody. One of his scams was he had telephones on his desk, which was by no means a common thing in business in those days. And when someone came in asking for a peerage or whatever it was, suddenly the phone would ring on the desk and he'd say, "Oh, sorry, I have to take this. It's number 10. Actually, he lived at number 10 Hyde Park Gate, so it was probably his chauffeur or his housemaid calling him. But of course, that was not the imputation that those sitting opposite him would have expected. I'm not sure how many times he met Lloyd George, but he certainly met a lot of influential people, mainly politicians, but also celebrities. He even was one of the ushers at the wedding of the Duke of York, George VI, as he later became, and Elizabeth, his bride, who of course became the Queen Mum.
I mean, how do you get that gig if you're an impresario? I mean, are we looking at a time then after the First World War where there is, I'm not saying there's a sweeping new social order, but some of the barriers are coming down and it's almost trying to be a meritocracy? Or, I mean, is his smoozing game so good that he gets in here?
Well, he was an excellent schmoozer. Probably the reason he became an usher at the Duke of York's wedding was because his magazine, which he published every week, carried for nothing page-size advertisements for the Royal Navy. And, of course, the Duke of York had served in the First World War and was a naval officer. And so I'm sure that played a part in how he got there. I think he knew a lot of people and claimed to know more people than he did know. But he was a convenient conduit for the sale of honours. If you can remember, Stanley Baldwin described with some contempt the hard-faced men who've done rather well out of the war, by which he meant the manufacturers of arms and uniforms and all the rest of the paraphernalia. And some of them, believe it or not, were actually trading with the enemy in the First World War. They were selling oil and selling meat to the Germans. And some of these men subsequently got put forward for honours. That was something that stuck in the craw of the king. But he didn't have the power anymore to actually veto any of these honours.
So, I mean, the people who are buying these honours, is it the nouveau riche? I mean, here we are 100 years on, same kind of thing. I mean, people are rewarded, want to have something on their business card, or because you still see people sort of buying a plot of, 1 square bit of Scotland, and then they can become, chief of the so-and-so clan. Was that the reason? They just wanted something to say, look, we have arrived. I may have come from humble backgrounds in Rochdale, nothing against Rochdale, but I am now, Lord so-and-so of so-and-so. Was it purely sort of
absolutely
vanity?
That was almost certainly the motivation of an awful lot of them. Power in the country had passed in the mid-19th century away from the landed estates and the aristocracy towards the men who were rich from business and commerce. And they had started to really supplant the earls and the lords of previous generations because they had money, and they could throw their weight around and generate their own influence. So Maundy Gregory was tapping into all that. You would probably go and see him and say, of course, it's not for myself that I want this knighthood, but the little lady back home would really appreciate being Lady So-and-so. And he certainly traded on that.
I suppose for all the fans of Downton Abbey, who that is old school, of course, and then you've got, but they can't afford to run the family home, so you've got all these nouveau rich people coming up and saying, well, yeah, of course, so I can have a home, but I need a title with it as well.
Yes, absolutely. And the First World War had wiped out a large number of the heirs of the landed estates of Britain. They were the subalterns who'd led their men over the top and been targeted by the Germans as they were junior officers and massacred. And something like, I think, I've got the figure in the book, but it was something like a fifth of estates in England and Wales changed hands in the first 5 or 6 years after the war. They were being sold out. They were being sold up. The old aristocracy was moving to the London townhouses. They were getting rid of their estates. They couldn't afford to keep them up, and they didn't have heirs any longer to pass them on to. So they were being bought up by the nouveau riche.
Fascinating. He's an impresario, and so I'm thinking he's got a cane there at some point. He obviously likes he's been an actor, and as we know, if you've had the pleasure of working with actors, which I presume you've met quite a few in your time, Stephen, as I have, they tend to be sort of cutting a dash. Was he sort of very much the Savile Row type? Was he well dressed and a bit of a dandy?
He certainly was, yes. And when he'd been a theatre manager for one of the big touring companies in the Northwest, this is way before the honours period, he'd ordered an orchid to be sent up from London every day and delivered to the theatre by horse-drawn carriage. This caused a certain disquiet amongst the management of the theatre company, who saw him spending money hand over fist, their money, and they eventually got rid of him for embezzlement. So that didn't go very well. His time as an impresario ended in disaster when he wasn't able to pay the cast of a musical he was putting on in the West End. And so he drifted between things and was making money as and where he could. Now,
there's a dark turn to this tale, because so far, even if was his name actually, I'm just thinking, if he's an impresario, and he's an actor and he's got this front, is his name actually Maundy Gregory, or is his name sort of Bill Withers from the Northwest?
No, he was Maundy Gregory. His father was a vicar in Southampton, and he was originally supposedly going to train for ordination, but that didn't appeal to him for some unfathomable reason.
But we have this thing about so far sort of dandyish. He's a bit of a rascal, a bit of a chancer. But there is a dark side to this, because, as you're right, we suspect he's a murderer. Just tell me, is this during the time, or is this during the sort of the fall, if you like?
It was during the fall, really. Eventually, he sold or wanted to sell an honour to a chap who ran a big dairy company, now part of Morrison's. The chap died after handing over the money, but before the honour could be awarded. And so his relatives all demanded the money back because it had not been delivered. And Maundy had spent it, so there was no way of getting it back, and he was plunged into debt. Maundy Gregory had lived for quite a number of years with a retired chorus girl. He was almost certainly gay. It was a platonic relationship, but they lived together. Her name was Edith Ross, and she'd been married previously to a band leader. But that had fallen apart. They lived, incidentally, in the big building in Abbey Road, which subsequently became the recording studios after they left. So anyway, Edith Ross had money. She had about £18,000 in the bank, which was, funnily enough, precisely the sum he needed to get to pay off the relatives of the milk magnate. And funnily enough, quite soon afterwards, she died, rather unexpectedly, and was buried rather rapidly in a churchyard overlooking the River Thames. And she was buried in a very shallow grave, which was almost guaranteed to flood in the winter. And by the time the police got involved, Maundy Gregory had escaped the country, and they found that they couldn't identify whether this corpse, which was in a flooded grave, had actually been poisoned or not. So he possibly got away with that. He certainly got her money. And the outlier of the story is that suspicions remain. Maybe he didn't poison her, but certainly her death was very lucky for him.
So when the sort of the cash for honours sort of system fell down, was it quick? I mean, did it sort of fall very rapidly? And was he then suddenly shoved out, and had to sort of to shut down and get out of Dodge quite quickly then?
Well, it was slightly more complicated than that. The Honours Abuses Act was passed in 1925, which cut off his source for peerages and all that. But he then went on to start selling Catholic honours, which, of course, weren't subject to this act. And so, if you wanted to be called a papal knight, which quite a few people did, probably mostly Catholics, he would acquire it for you. And eventually he was getting so desperately short for money that he started approaching a number of people who probably didn't need to buy honours, one of whom was a retired naval war hero called Billiard Leake, who was extremely rich himself and a close friend of the royal circle, so really didn't need to buy an honour. And instead of telling Maundy where to go, Billiard Leake went to the police, and at last they had someone who was willing to testify against him for trying to sell honours. He was tried and wanted to plead not guilty, but was persuaded by his Conservative contacts. Funnily enough, the Conservatives were upset about him by this stage. They persuaded him to plead guilty in return for a very light sentence, a small fine, and exile in Paris, which is what happened. He pleaded guilty, kept his mouth shut about who he'd sold honours to, and when he came out from a 7-week sentence at Wormwood Scrubs, he was met by a taxi, which whisked him over to Newhaven and the Channel ports for ferry to France, spent most of the rest of his life in Paris, and was eventually arrested by the Germans when they invaded in 1940, and died in one of their internment camps. So that was a fairly sticky end for a rather extraordinary and notorious career.
I'm just imagining him in Paris, which is obviously at that point full of white Russians because they've escaped the revolution, all these displaced royal families from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It must have been his milieu, surely, because he's inventing so many things. Did you find out how was his life in Paris? Did he live relatively comfortably in Paris then?
Well, he did. He got in those days. He got a sort of monthly brown envelope, basically, with a pension in it, and he started off in one of the poshest hotels in the middle of Paris, but then moved into a very small bedsit. And he was very lonely. He had a pet dog, and he'd spend most of his days in the bar of various hotels. And he'd lost a lot of his influence. People really didn't want to know him from the expatriate British community in France. He tried living in Dieppe, which had a big expatriate British community. And he went downhill rather rapidly. He became alcoholic, and when the Germans came in 1940, instead of trying to escape back to England, probably because he thought he might be still under investigation for alleged murder, he fled in front of the Germans and ended up in Finisterre in the far west of Brittany, staying in a local pension. And the Germans arrived and set up in the hotel. So he moved into the attic where he lived secretly for a number of months until he couldn't stand it anymore, went out for a walk and got arrested and transported back to Paris. There were a couple of camps which housed British expatriates who hadn't managed to escape, people like waiters in Parisian hotels and things like that. And so he thought it was a bit déclassé for him to be mingling with English jockeys and waiters. And I think that probably enhanced his isolation, as did the fact that he couldn't get hold of much whiskey anymore. And he went into a decline and sadly died.
What was the sort of fallout for Lloyd George? I mean, did he obviously distance himself quite quickly? I mean, was there any sort of kickback or result for him? Because I mean, he needed the cash. I mean, did this hasten the decline for Lloyd George? Was there a scandal around that, or did politics just carry on? Yeah.
Politics did carry on. He had a few sticky moments in the Commons when he was cross-examined about this. But frankly, he didn't see much wrong with it. He wasn't directly involved himself. That was his chief whip and various party apparatchiks. And Lloyd George said, well, this is a more honest system than any other way we could raise cash. He thought that his career was far from over when the coalition government ended in 1923. He thought that he'd soon get back into power, and that was not to be. The Liberal Party was irretrievably split. People who wanted to vote progressively could now choose the Labour Party, which soon came into government. And although he stayed in the Commons, Lloyd George never again achieved power in the remaining 20-odd years of his life.
So when you write a book like this and you research a book like that, is it a sort of, here we are almost 100 years later, is it plus ça change? Because you're thinking, because we've had these scandals and some very interesting, and I'm using parentheses, very, very, like a Tyrannosaurus Rex here, but do you think, so much has changed, but then again, people want a title. People, the most, shall we say, inauspicious types will try.
Yes, well, certainly that's somewhat true. None quite as disreputable as some of the characters that Maundy Gregory put up for honours. Things have changed a bit in that in those days you didn't have to disclose who was giving you money. And things now are a bit more open. But of course, as we've seen in recent years, people are still very willing to buy honours in return for services rendered in various ways. And so nothing quite has changed, and no one's really come up with a solution about sponsorship of political parties. The idea that they might be funded by the state is really not very attractive as an option. And so parties are still looking to raise money from donors. These days they have to be a bit more open about it, but not entirely transparent, as it's been proved.
Was this fun to research and write? Because you've done this sort of thing before, Stephen. But was this I know is it a cautionary tale, or was it he is such a rascal as you said, even though there's a little bit of a dark underbelly to it. Was it a fun one to put pen to paper or finger to keyboard?
Yes, it was. I mean, it's a fascinating political period because the government was under such stress and strain, both during the First World War and immediately afterwards, as they tried to negotiate a stable form of government, which took some time to manage. So I went round the various archives. Unfortunately, the main previous book about Maundy Gregory was over 50 years ago, and the author of that, a chap called Tom Cullen, managed to speak to some of Gregory's contacts, but of course they're now all long gone, so that wasn't an option. But there are still files in the National Archives and the British Newspaper Library, and you can also, as I say, look to your previous career as a political correspondent, which helps.
The book is called The Man Who Sold Honours. It's by Stephen Bates. Listeners, you can go to our own virtual bookstore, click on the rather splendid front cover, and it'll be winging its way to you by a well-known distribution service. If people want to say nice things to you, Stephen, do you have a website? Do you dance?
I do.
The social media?
Yes.
Where can people find you?
My website is stephenbateswriter.com. Stephen with a PH, stephenbateswriter.com, and you'll also find links there to my email address and that sort of thing. So, yes, brickbats on their way.
Marvellous. The book is called The Man Who Sold Honours. It's by Stephen Bates. Stephen, it's been an absolute honour to speak to you this morning.
Thank you very much, Giles. Lovely to speak to you too.